All right. So as I was saying before the break, there's natural selection, which we talked about, in which natural variations within a population are either an advantage or could be a disadvantage, and they become more or less common over time. And that, oh, I forgot about this. Another type of selection, which we just talked about, is artificial selection, when it's humans choosing which individuals survive, which individuals mate together, and that could change a species over time. Another type of selection is called sexual selection. And sexual selection is when there's differential reproduction, okay, and that leads to changes in the species over time. Can anyone think of a species when the male and female versions look different from each other? What's that? Okay, humans. Yeah. What else? Lions. Yeah, lions, right? Male and female lions look pretty distinct. You can tell them apart easily. Lots of birds. So, do you know what a mallard duck is? A male mallard duck has a colorful head, colorful patterns. The female just has sort of brownish tan coloration. Lots of species. This is a pattern we see with lots of species. What's that? Yep, cows and bulls. Cardinals. So when you imagine a cardinal, what do you think of? A red, bright red bird. Those cardinals, those are female cardinals. Male cardinals have basically the exact same shape, but they're kind of like a grayish, slightly reddish color. You may not have noticed them, right? Because a female cardinal is like very distinct, and you see them, they're bright. The male, oh, I'm sorry, I just mixed that up. The females are darker in color. The males are brightly colored. And this is the pattern we see all the time. Oftentimes, males have showier colors, and females have sort of drab colors. What is the and so here's some examples. Okay. Here you have a male wren on the left, brightly colored, very vibrant blue, and then the female. Ducks, these are wood ducks. Mallard ducks have the same pattern to their coloration as well. A peacock, when you imagine a peacock that you go to the Utica Zoo, you see peacocks walking around, okay? What you notice is the male peacock with the huge tail feathers, okay? The female peahen doesn't have those large tail feathers. These patterns are a result of what's called sexual selection, that typically in many species, males are competing to mate with females, and females choose a mate that has bright coloration, a large, showy feathers, and that leads over time to the males that have the largest tails or the brightest colors have more success in reproduction and therefore pass on those genes more than others. What's the selection for the females to be like drab in color? So we see the females in all of these situations are just kind of like grayish, brownish. How is that? What's the selection there? Yeah, but there's something else to it too, John. Why? How's that helpful? Yeah, often in many of these species, the females are either incubating eggs or caring for young. And in those situations, it's more of an advantage to blend in and avoid predators. So often we see these two types of selection for males to be brightly colored, showy, large feathers, and females to be drab in color, so that they are less likely to be preyed upon. It's not just birds, happens in other species as well. Here are some examples. You can see in these fish, guppies, for example, oftentimes the males are much more brightly colored. Peacocks, even these beetles, the males have this large projection or exoskeleton. Deer, right? Male deer have antlers, female deer do not. Males compete for females by this display of their antlers and so forth. Lions, these are even lizards. They have the dewlap. Males have this dewlap that they display during mating, and females select the mate based on this. So these are all examples of what we call sexual selection. This is also when you see an animal that has the males and females look distinct, it's called sexual dimorphism. Another thing that we often will look at as we're talking about evolution is sort of a family tree, an evolutionary history of species. And the way that we look at this are using these diagrams, these sort of branching tree diagrams that kind of show us how different species have evolved over time. These are called cladograms. Here's a very simple one. What does this tell us about humans and mushrooms and flowers? Jordan? Yeah, they all have a common ancestor back here. What else does it tell us? What? Yeah, go ahead, Ash. Right. We might think, well, they grow out of the ground, a mushroom and a tulip are more similar to each other. But when we actually look at their DNA, we find humans and fungi are more closely related than humans and the tulips. And that's shown here because we have to go back not quite as far to find the common ancestor of the mushroom and the human versus the common ancestor of all of them. That's a simplified version. We could have more complex versions. Here we have a few different species of animals, of mammals, right? And we can see through this branching tree diagram, these are all animals in one order, the order Carnivora. So we could answer some questions based on this. Like, for example, is a skunk more closely related to an otter or a leopard? Which one? How do you know? Right, we have to go back to here to find the common ancestor of the otter and the skunk. To find the common ancestor of the leopard and the skunk, we have to go back farther in time. Okay, and so we can see through these diagrams they all had a common ancestor at some point in the past. Okay, but we can see how these species are related based on these diagrams, and these diagrams are typically created using, now we use DNA evidence, right? If we compare the DNA of different species, we can find out very accurately which species are more closely related to which other species. So when we think about sort of the history of life on Earth, what was the first life on Earth? Yeah, single-celled organisms, most closely similar to bacteria. Bacteria are very simple cells. They don't have complex organelles. It's basically a cell membrane wrapped around some cytoplasm with some DNA, some genetic material. Bacteria were the first organisms that evolved on Earth in the oceans. That was 3.5 billion years ago. How old is the Earth? Little more than 4.5 billion years old. Okay, there was about 1 billion years when there was no life on Earth. So the first life on Earth were simple bacteria. They evolved. So there was DNA. They reproduced, and over time, evolution led to more complex single-celled organisms. We call them eukaryotes, cells that have organelles. Um, they evolved to be able to do the process of photosynthesis. The atmosphere of the earth changed over time. Oxygen started to accumulate. Um, Eventually, organisms that reproduce sexually evolved and increased the ability to create variation, leading to sort of quicker evolution. Eventually, multicellular organisms evolved. Again, all still in the water. Invertebrate animals evolved. And at this point, everything still lived in the water. Eventually, life moved on to land. Some producers evolved into be plants and eventually moved on to land. Eventually, then vertebrate animals evolved um, on in the oceans at first, and then moved on to land, and then eventually birds and mammals until we end up with the diversity of life we have today. Um, so the scientists that showed sort of the first that you could have um, inorganic molecules. They basically, these two scientists that won a Nobel Prize were Miller and Urey. And basically, what they did is they created this apparatus and they tried to recreate what scientists think the very early atmosphere and the very early oceans of the earth, what they were like. And then they zapped it with electricity. That was modeling electricity through lightning. And what they found is they could mix together a bunch of simple molecules that were present in the early Earth. And when they did this experiment and zapped it with electricity, what they found is the formation of very simple organic molecules. And this is where they felt the first molecules of life originally came from, these reactions that took place on the very early Earth. And eventually that led to the simple bacteria that were the first living organisms to evolve. And then complexity increased from there through the history of the Earth, through the last 4 billion years. So we could see sort of some of that evolution of animals and other organisms over the last several 100 million years. All right, any questions about that?